While the world has spent this past week watching the catastrophe unfolding in Colombia, a magnitude 7.4 earthquake that has now killed more than 220 people, injured over 1,000, and left thousands more reported missing after striking the Choco region on the 10th of August, a considerably quieter story has been playing out on the other side of the world, underneath a stretch of the San Francisco Bay Area. Most residents drive past every day without a second thought. For months now, seismologists have been tracking a persistent, unusual pattern of earthquake activity clustered beneath the East Bay town of San Ramon, sitting directly atop the Hayward Fault, one of the major branches of the broader San Andreas Fault system. This is not a single dramatic quake, making headlines the way Colombia's has. It is something scientists find genuinely more puzzling, a fault that keeps producing swarm after swarm of small to moderate earthquakes, defying the typical pattern seismologists expect faults to follow, and doing so in one of the most densely populated, seismically significant regions in the entire country. This is the story of what has actually been happening beneath San Ramon, why the pattern itself is scientifically unusual rather than simply frequent, whether it has anything to do with the earthquake that just devastated Colombia, and what seismologists say residents of the Bay Area should actually take from it. No hype, no exaggeration, just what the seismic data and the scientists studying it actually say. Drop a comment and tell me if you have ever felt one of these smaller Bay Area quakes yourself, because a genuinely significant number of people living in the East Bay have, often without realizing it was part of a much longer running pattern. I read every one of these. If you want grounded science coverage built on the actual seismic data instead of recycled panic, subscribe. It is free, and a like helps this reach people who need to understand what is actually happening beneath their own neighborhood. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Thank you. Now let us get into it. Let us address the obvious question directly before going any further, because it is the one almost anyone hearing about unusual fault activity near San Francisco during the same week as a deadly earthquake in Colombia would immediately ask. These two events are not connected. Colombia's earthquake occurred along the Colombia-Ecuador Trench, where the small Malpelo Plate is being pushed underneath the South American Plate at a subduction zone, a completely different kind of tectonic boundary than the one running beneath California. The San Andreas Fault system, including the Hayward Fault beneath San Ramon, is a transform boundary where the Pacific and North American plates slide horizontally past each other rather than one plunging beneath the other. Seismologists have found no mechanism by which stress released on a subduction zone thousands of miles away in Colombia would meaningfully transfer to a transform fault system in California. The timing is a coincidence of two entirely unrelated stories briefly sharing the same news cycle, not two chapters of the same underlying event, and treating it otherwise would be exactly the kind of unfounded claim this channel tries to avoid. What makes the San Ramon activity genuinely unusual has nothing to do with Colombia at all, and everything to do with how differently it behaves compared to a typical earthquake sequence. In a standard earthquake sequence, a single main shock releases the bulk of the accumulated stress, followed by a string of progressively smaller and less frequent aftershocks that gradually taper off over days or weeks. An earthquake swarm works almost the opposite way. Rather than one dominant event followed by a fading tail, a swarm consists of dozens or even hundreds of earthquakes of broadly similar size, clustered tightly in time and location without any single quake standing out as the clear main event, and the activity can persist or even reignite for weeks or months rather than steadily dying down. The current episode beneath San Ramon traces back to at least November of last year, when more than 4 Thai earthquakes struck the area in a single day, the largest reaching magnitude 3.8. Activity continued into December, then again in early February of this year, when a magnitude 3.9 event and a cluster of quakes ranging from magnitude 2.5 to 3.3 struck the same several kilometer stretch southeast of San Ramon. By that point, the United States Geological Survey estimated that roughly 300 earthquakes had occurred in that same area since the beginning of December alone. Geophysicists studying the region have found that this specific pattern is not entirely new, which is itself part of what makes it scientifically interesting rather than alarming in isolation. Dr. Anne-Marie Balté, a geophysicist and seismologist with the United States Geological Survey, has pointed out that San Ramon has experienced documented swarms stretching back decades in 1970, 1976, 1990, 2002, 2003, 2015, 2018, and now again beginning in November of last year. Seismologists studying the underlying cause point to a few possible explanations, including fluid migration deep within the crust-altering pressure, along small fault segments or subtle stress adjustments where the Hayward Fault interacts with the nearby Pleasanton Fault, a smaller structure running close by that some researchers believe may actually be the more direct source of this specific swarm's activity. based on how precisely the earthquakes align with its mapped trace, rather than the main Calaveras fault itself. The reason seismologists take this pattern seriously, even without any single dramatic quake to point to, comes down to what the Calaveras fault is ultimately capable of producing over the long term. Geological studies show the fault can generate an earthquake in the magnitude 6.5 to 7 range, given enough accumulated time, and it connects directly into the Hayward Fault near Dublin and Danville, a fault the United States Geological Survey has separately identified as significantly overdue for a major rupture, with more than 150s, years having passed since its last big earthquake in 1868, against a historical average recurrence interval of roughly 140 to 160 years. Researchers have generally found that recorded swarms in this specific area have not gone on to precede larger, damaging earthquakes, and Fault herself has been careful to note that how these swarms cluster and behave remains difficult to predict with any real precision, but the broader geological setting these swarms are occurring within, directly atop a fault system capable of a magnitude 7 event running beneath a stretch of the East Bay home to millions of residents, is exactly why continued monitoring matters, regardless of whether any individual swarm turns out to be a precursor to something larger. Modern monitoring has also given seismologists a far more detailed picture of this swarm than they would have had access to during earlier episodes decades ago. Dense networks of seismometers across the Bay Area now detect and locate even very small earthquakes, magnitude 1 and below, that would have gone entirely unnoticed by instruments available during the 1970s and 1980s swarms Fault referenced. That improved sensitivity is part of why the current tally of roughly 300 events sounds so much larger than historical swarm counts. And researchers are careful to note that a genuine part of that difference reflects better detection capability rather than necessarily a larger or more energetic swarm than the region has experienced before. Cross-sections of the earthquake locations show the seismicity tracing almost straight down from the fault trace at the surface to depths of around 9 kilometers. A pattern researchers say is more consistent with the nearby Pleasanton Fault structure than with the main trace of the Calaveras Fault itself, illustrating just how complex the underground fault network beneath this single valley actually is once examined closely. This is also not the first time this exact question, whether one part of California's fault network could be quietly setting up trouble for another, has drawn serious scientific attention in this region. The Bay area sits above 8 separate mapped fault lines, and researchers have specifically studied whether stress from a swarm in one location could plausibly transfer onto a neighboring fault segment. Historical analysis of Bay Area swarms going back to the 1970s has generally found that while these events can theoretically add incremental stress to adjacent fault segments, the swarms themselves have not been reliable predictors of when or where a larger, damaging earthquake will ultimately occur, which is precisely why the United States Geological Survey continues to base its long-term hazard estimates for faults like Hayward and Calaveras on broader historical recurrence patterns rather than on any single swarm as a specific warning sign. So what does all of this actually mean for you, whether you live in the Bay Area yourself or are simply watching this from somewhere else entirely? The practical lesson is not that a major imminent earthquake has been specifically forecast for San Ramon, because seismologists have been explicit that they cannot make that kind of specific prediction. This stretch of California sits on a fault system scientists already consider significantly overdue for a serious earthquake, and that months of unusual persistent swarm activity is a genuine reminder, not a new alarm, to keep basic earthquake preparedness current, secured furniture, a stocked emergency kit, and a clear family plan, the same baseline. Precautions seismologists have been recommending for this region for years, regardless of any single swarm. The honest, grounded summary is this. While global attention has rightly focused on the devastating magnitude 7.4 earthquake that struck Colombia's Choco region on the 10th of August, killing more than 220 people, a separate and scientifically unrelated pattern has continued playing out beneath San Ramon, California, where the Calaveras Fault has produced hundreds of small to moderate earthquakes in a swarm pattern stretching back to last November, a pattern seismologists find scientifically distinctive because of how it defies the typical main shock and aftershock sequence, even as they caution that swarms like this one have not historically preceded larger, damaging earthquakes in this specific area. We are going to keep tracking stories like this exactly the way we tracked it today, straight from the United States Geological Survey and the seismologists actually studying this fault system, not recycled panic headlines. Subscribe so you do not miss how this swarm activity develops, because based on the decades-long pattern in this exact spot, it is very unlikely to be the last one. And leave that comment below Tell me if you have ever felt a Bay Area earthquake yourself, because millions of people living directly above this fault system have, often without knowing the full history behind the ground shaking beneath their own street. Because behind every one of these numbers is a family in Colombia's Chaco region searching through rubble for missing loved ones, and thousands of miles away, a family in San Ramon who felt their house shake again this week and simply went back to what they were doing. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.